come to me with the lament that life seems to repeat itself, that no matter what changes externally, the same emotional wound finds a new costume and walks back into your heart. The faces alter, the circumstances disguise themselves with novelty, yet the drama remains identical. You call it fate. I call it compulsion, the repetition compulsion that the unconscious commands with tyrannical precision. What you perceive as coincidence is the mind's secret loyalty to its earliest suffering. Every time you repeat the pain, you are unconsciously seeking to master it, to finally rewrite the ending that once overwhelmed you. Yet each repetition deepens the groove, making it harder to distinguish the original wound from its countless reproductions. You see, the unconscious has no sense of time. It preserves, intact and alive, the emotions of the child you once were. Those buried impulses and anxieties continue their motion beneath the crust of civilized life. The ego may have matured, acquired education, manners, and language, but the unconscious primitive, timeless, and ruthless still seeks discharge. It does not forget the trauma that birthed it. On the contrary, it orchestrates your adult behavior to stage again the very conflict you could not resolve in infancy. And so you are condemned to repetition until the repressed material becomes conscious, until you dare to face what your psyche hides in its most forbidden chambers. If we listen carefully, the neurotic symptom speaks the dialect of the unconscious. It says, "Remember me." Every anxiety, every failed relationship, every inexplicable attraction is a disguised fragment of memory seeking recognition. You call it bad luck. I call it disguised desire. You speak of destiny. I speak of repression. For destiny, my dear listener, is often nothing more than the unconscious made visible. Consider a patient who perpetually chooses partners who humiliate him. He insists he wants love, yet he gravitates only toward rejection. When I question him, he confesses that as a child he felt invisible to a distant mother and feared her disapproval more than death itself. What he repeats is not desire for pain, but a reenactment of that earliest emotional script. In his unconscious, humiliation has become the only familiar form of contact. To be rejected is to be seen at last. This is how the psyche betrays itself, by clinging to the wound as if it were love. Repetition is the shadow of repression. What cannot be remembered is compelled to be repeated. You think you have escaped your past, but the past has merely changed its costume. When the patient falls in love, quarrels, or despairs, he is not dealing with the beloved or the enemy of the present moment. He is confronting the figures of his internal theater, projected onto new actors. Love becomes the arena where the ego meets its buried ghosts. Every embrace conceals an ancient cry, "Mother, look at me." Every quarrel with the beloved repeats the primal protest against the father's authority. Thus, we are less free in our affections than we believe. We are bound by the invisible strings of our unconscious dramas. When I first observed this pattern, I realized that human beings are not primarily driven by the pursuit of pleasure, but by the need to master the unmastered. Pleasure is the disguise. The compulsion to repeat is the truth. Even the erotic drive, the libido itself, serves a double master, eros, the force of life, and thanatos, the drive toward destruction and return to the inanimate. Every act of creation bears within it a trace of death, and every act of destruction conceals a wish for rebirth. This duality pulses through the entire organism of the mind. We love because we wish to fuse, and we destroy because we wish to be free of fusion. In this conflict lies the rhythm of our psychological existence. The ego, poor mediator between the id and the superego, struggles endlessly to maintain equilibrium. On one side, the id demands satisfaction, primitive and irrational, speaking only the language of desire. On the other, the superego thunders with moral law, the internalized voice of parental judgment and societal prohibition. The ego stands in the middle, trembling under the tension of opposing commands. When the pressure grows unbearable, repression emerges as its desperate mechanism, a guardian at the gate, pushing intolerable impulses into the unconscious. Yet what is repressed does not die. It returns, deformed, disguised, symbolic. The repressed idea finds its revenge in dreams, slips of the tongue, obsessions, and accidents. It returns precisely at the moment when you most wish to appear composed. Dreams, my dear students, are the royal road to the unconscious. In them, repression sleeps, and the forbidden desires parade before us in the disguise of symbols. The dream takes the language of primitive imagination. The cave becomes the womb. The serpent, the phallus, the fall, the surrender to desire. We wake in confusion, believing the dream absurd. Yet every absurdity conceals logic twisted by censorship. If you listen to a patient's dream long enough, translating symbol into instinct, metaphor into memory, you will see the repetition in another form, the return of the repressed disguised as imagery. I recall a woman who dreamt repeatedly of drowning in a dark lake. Upon analysis, we uncovered the memory of nearly suffocating as a child under the oppressive silence of a cruel father. Her dream was not about water, but about speech withheld, breath stolen, self-submerged. In her waking life, she spoke softly, obeyed compulsively, and found herself attracted to men who silenced her. The lake was her childhood. The drowning, her Unspokenrage. Through the dream, her unconscious whispered what her conscious mind dared not articulate. And so, to understand why one repeats pain, one must descend beneath morality and memory into that archaic domain where desire and fear share the same root. Civilization teaches us to suppress. Religion moralizes suppression. Culture rewards the appearance of self-control. But beneath the polite mask of the superego, the id watches, waiting for its turn. The more severe the repression, the more violent its return. The hysteric trembles because her body has become the stage for her silenced emotion. The obsessive repeats rituals because they offer symbolic mastery over inner chaos. The melancholic turns rage inward, transforming the lost object into self-attack. Each symptom is a monument to repression. In my consulting room, I have witnessed how the unconscious insists on truth, even when the ego resists it. A man dreams of killing his father and awakens in terror, insisting he loved him. Yet the wish, though repressed, has merely changed its expression. The son who worships his father's ideals to the point of self-erasure is still enacting the same wish to be the father, to replace him. In the psychic economy, identification is but the civilized mask of rivalry. The son merges with the father to avoid acknowledging the hostility toward him. Thus, love becomes the camouflage of hate, and submission the strategy of control. We are, all of us, haunted by the residues of our infantile conflicts. No analysis can proceed without tracing the adult symptom back to its childhood prototype. The neurosis of today is the child's fantasy made flesh. A patient's fear of abandonment echoes the infant's terror of losing the mother's gaze. The compulsion to control stems from the helplessness of early dependency. Every obsession hides a wish. Every inhibition guards a secret satisfaction. The unconscious, indifferent to moral categories, recognizes only fulfillment or frustration. The ego calls one virtue and the other sin, but the unconscious smiles at such distinctions. If you would truly understand your repetitions, you must relinquish the illusion of self-knowledge. What you call I is but a small island surrounded by the vast sea of the unconscious. You are not the master of your house, the stranger who inhabits you, the repressed desire, the forbidden fantasy, the infantile wish commands from the cellar of your mind. You decorate the upper rooms with reason and morality, but the foundation trembles with ancient instinct. When you repeat the same pain, it is not stupidity nor bad fortune. It is obedience to the hidden sovereign within. The only freedom possible lies in making the unconscious conscious, in descending into that cellar and recognizing the face of the stranger. You will ask, why does the mind create such suffering? Because repression is the price of civilization. To live in society, we must renounce the direct expression of instinct. Every culture is built upon the sublimation of libido, upon channeling sexual and aggressive energy into art, religion, and work. Without repression, there would be chaos. Without sublimation, no creation. But repression is never complete. What is not sublimated festers. It accumulates in the unconscious until it bursts forth as neurosis, dream, or repetition. Thus, our greatest achievements and our deepest sufferings share the same root. The displacement of instinct. The tragedy of man is not that he represses, but that he forgets he is repressed. The forgetting becomes identity. You begin to believe that your politeness is virtue rather than fear, that your ambition is freedom rather than disguised hunger for approval. And so you repeat, not only emotional pain, but the very conditions that created it. You return to the same kind of lover, the same form of humiliation, the same failure. Because somewhere in you lies the secret hope that this time the story will end differently. Yet the unconscious is literal. It has no sense of narrative closure. It simply replays what it knows. The patient who repeats suffering imagines he is being tested by life, punished perhaps by God or fate. But in the analytic room, we learn to read this punishment as a disguised satisfaction. The repetition compulsion is not a mere accident of character. It is the symptom's persistence in finding its object of pleasure. For pleasure, in the Freudian sense, is not happiness. It is the discharge of tension, the reduction of inner excitation. If suffering achieves that reduction, the psyche will cling to it, with the same intensity it clings to joy. Thus, pain itself becomes a perverse fulfillment, the proof that the old wound still burns, that the forbidden wish is still alive beneath the ashes. When one repeats, one is attempting mastery. But mastery of what? The unconscious seeks to reverse the original helplessness of trauma. The child who could not protest now recreates the situation as adult, hoping unconsciously to emerge victorious this time. But since the repressed emotion is not integrated, the outcome remains identical, defeat disguised as fate. Repetition is the neurotic's tragic play, endlessly performed before an audience of ghosts. To interrupt repetition, one must uncover the desire hidden in it. Every symptom, however painful, conceals a fragment of libido, of love, energy, misdirected. The hysteric's paralysis hides a wish to refuse motion. The obsessive's ritual masks the fantasy of omnipotent control. The melancholic's despair protects against hatred toward the lost object. In each case, the symptom is the compromise between the forbidden wish and the ego's censorship. The analytic task is to translate symptom back into wish, to restore meaning to what has become mechanical suffering. Let us return to dreams, those nocturnal theaters of the unconscious. When the ego sleeps, censorship relaxes, and desire finds partielle expression. The dream fulfills the wish that waking life denies, but in disguise. The displacement, condensation, and symbolism of dream work are the mind's way of satisfying and repressing simultaneously. To dream of climbing a staircase, to embrace a stranger, to lose one's teeth, each image conceals instinctual meaning. The patient who dismisses his dream as nonsense forgets that nonsense is the language of repression. Only through the logic of distortion can the forbidden pass the guard of consciousness. In analysis, we encourage the patient to free associate, to let thoughts emerge without censorship. The associations that arise seem trivial, but their chain reveals the path of repression. A forgotten word, a joke, a hesitation all betray the unconscious. The analyst listens not for coherence, but for slips, gaps, contradictions. It is in these cracks that the repressed returns, when the patient resists, when he insists that nothing comes to mind. That moment is most telling. Resistance is the guardian of repression. Silence is the unconscious screaming through the mouth of denial. The ego's defense is repression, projection, displacement, rationalization. Reaction formation are ingenious mechanisms of survival. They protect the conscious mind from anxiety by distorting reality. But protection has a cost: stagnation. When you project your aggression onto others, you lose touch with your own strength. When you rationalize failure, you forfeit growth. When you repress desire, you strangle creativity. The ego believes it is maintaining order. In truth, it is perpetuating repetition. In my work with war neuroses, I observed that soldiers relived the trauma of battle in dreams, not as triumphs, but as fresh defeats. They did not seek pleasure, but mastery over fear. Yet the repetition of terror was not healing but compulsive. I began to suspect that there exists within the psyche a drive beyond the pleasure principle, a compulsion toward death, toward the inorganic state from which life arose. Thanatos, the death drive. Counters, eros, the drive to preserve and unite. The repetition of suffering, therefore, is not merely the return of repressed desire, but the expression of this darker instinct, the longing for rest, for dissolution, for an end to tension itself. If eros builds civilization, thanatos dismantles it. Within each human, these forces wage their eternal war. The artist sublimates thanatos by destroying in order to create. The lover merges life and death in the ecstasy of orgasm. The neurotic suffers because he cannot sublimate, and his energy turns inward, eroding the self. To repeat the same pain is to flirt with the death drive while pretending to seek life. It is an unconscious pact with annihilation disguised as self-improvement. You may protest, "Surely I do not wish to suffer," but the wish is not conscious. The unconscious is amoral, timeless, and literal. It preserves both love and hate for the same object. You may consciously love your parent, yet unconsciously wish their removal. You may consciously crave peace, yet your inner world feeds on conflict. The contradiction is not hypocrisy, it is the structure of the psyche itself. The infant learns love and hatred in the same cradle. To feed and to bite, to cling and to strike. These impulses coexist in the earliest relation to the mother. Later life merely refines the expression. but never resolves the tension. And so, the man who seeks tenderness may provoke rejection to justify his rage. The woman who longs for fidelity may choose the unfaithful to confirm her suspicion. Each calls forth from the world the very figure that matches their unconscious fantasy. This is the repetition compulsion in its purest form, the external world obeying the blueprint of internal conflict. The analytic cure begins when the patient perceives that his suffering is self-authored. But such recognition is not intellectual, it is emotional, visceral, often accompanied by shame and resistance. To see that one has been both victim and architect of pain is the first taste of freedom, and it is bitter. The analyst's role is not to give advice nor to moralize, but to interpret, to make conscious the unconscious motive behind behavior. Interpretation punctures the cycle of repetition by linking present emotion to past origin. When the patient says, "I feel abandoned," and we trace that feeling to the childhood experience of a mother who withdrew affection, the repetition becomes intelligible. What was compulsion becomes memory. What was acted out can now be spoken. Speech, in analysis, replaces symptom. Words become the medium of healing. Yet this process demands patience. The unconscious resists exposure as the body resists surgery. Every defense mechanism is a scar grown around an old wound. To remove it prematurely is cruelty. The analyst must wait until the patient is strong enough to bear the truth. The goal is not to destroy defenses, but to render them conscious. Only then can sublimation occur, the transformation of instinct into creation. The energy once trapped in repetition becomes available for art, love, and thought. In truth, the human psyche is a tragic masterpiece. Its structure ensures both civilization and neurosis, progress and pain. We cannot abolish repression without abolishing culture itself. But we can learn to recognize its workings, to live with awareness rather than ignorance. To understand your repetitions is not to escape them instantly, but to cease being their puppet. The moment you say, this is the old wound speaking, you are already freer than before. The compulsion to repeat, then, is both a curse and a teacher. It reveals what remains unresolved. What part of the soul still clings to its infantile stage? Each repetition is the unconscious inviting you to remember, to integrate, to complete the circle that began long ago. But few accept the invitation. Most prefer the comfort of familiar suffering to the terror of new freedom. The psyche, after all, would rather endure known pain than risk unknown pleasure. The roots of repetition lie buried in the earliest strata of the psyche, in that fragile period when the child, still half animal, learns that love can vanish. It is then that the ego begins to shape itself around loss. The child's first experience of absence, the mother leaving the room, the breast withheld, the silence after crying imprints upon the nervous system, a template of anxiety. This primal separation forms the nucleus of all later conflict. The unconscious records, not the mother's departure, but the terror of helplessness it provoked. And so, throughout life, one unconsciously reenacts the original scene of abandonment, hoping this time to reverse it, to make the beloved stay, to master the unbearable helplessness of infancy. But what is reenacted cannot be undone. It can only be understood. The repetition of pain is, therefore, the psyche's tragic loyalty to its origins. We repeat the wound because we have mistaken it for love. The child who was neglected equates neglect with affection. The child who was controlled confuses domination with care. Thus the adult, when choosing partners or careers, gravitates toward familiar dynamics, mistaking recognition for safety. The unconscious says, "This feels like home," and the ego obeys, unaware that home was once the site of suffering. Let me speak plainly. Every neurotic is a historian who has forgotten his own archives. The unconscious is that secret library where the first traumas remain unedited. What the historian forgets, he lives. The adult's heartbreak, failure, jealousy, and rage are footnotes to an unwritten childhood text. Until that text is read aloud in analysis, its author remains enslaved to its unfinished sentences. In the consulting room, one often sees this reenactment unfold with chilling precision. The patient transfers onto the analyst the very emotions once directed toward the parents. Love, hatred, dependency, rebellion, all reawaken in the transference. The analyst becomes the mother who withholds, the father who punishes, the lost object resurrected. The patient does not know he is repeating. He believes he is relating anew. But in truth, he is reliving. The analytic setting becomes the stage on which the unconscious dramatizes its buried conflicts. Only through this reenactment can the repressed be remembered and finally resolved. This is why transference is both the obstacle and the instrument of therapy. It reveals the mechanism of repetition at work. When the patient accuses the analyst of indifference, he is not describing reality, but projecting an ancient feeling. If the analyst retaliates or defends himself, he merely joins the play. But if he interprets, if he helps the patient see that the anger belongs to the past, now revived in the present, then repetition gives way to insight. The compulsion loosens, and memory replaces enactment. Yet even in analysis, the resistance to remembering is fierce. The ego fears the return of what it once banished. To recall a trauma is to feel again the helplessness of the child. The psyche therefore prefers to repeat unconsciously rather than to remember consciously. Repetition, after all, allows a sense of control. One can choose the moment of pain, even if unconsciously. Memory offers no such control. It exposes the wound to daylight. That is why the patient may act out instead of speaking missing sessions, quarreling with the analyst, recreating conflict instead of analyzing it. The analytic process must patiently translate action into language. You ask why awareness alone does not cure. Because insight without emotion remains barren. The repressed must be relived with feeling for integration to occur. The intellect may understand, but the unconscious must weep. When the buried affect rises to the surface, the grief, the rage, the longing then, the compulsion begins to dissolve. It is as though the psychic energy bound to the symptom is released and made available for life again. Until then, one continues to repeat, not out of choice, but out of necessity. Childhood, I have often said, is destiny. But destiny can be rewritten only by confronting the forgotten wish that shaped it. Every child once harbored forbidden desires to possess the parent, to eliminate the rival, to enjoy without restraint. The Oedipus complex, far from being mere mythology, is the drama of every psyche, the struggle between love and prohibition, desire and law. The repression of these infantile wishes is the foundation of morality and civilization, but also of neurosis. The very forces that make us human also condemn us to internal conflict. In the adult, these repressed Oedipal wishes resurface in disguised forms: jealousy in love, rivalry in work, guilt in success. The man who sabotages his triumph unconsciously fears surpassing the father. The woman who distrusts affection unconsciously remembers the ambivalence of early love. The compulsion to repeat is In many cases, the repetition of the Oedipal drama under new names and circumstances. The psyche seeks to resolve what it could not bear to know, but repression ensures that the play is always rerun, never concluded. The moral conscience, or superego, is the heir of this Oedipal repression, born from internalized parental authority. It watches, judges, and punishes the ego for its desires. It whispers, "You must not," even when no one is listening. It transforms instinct into guilt and guilt into self-sabotage. The superego, like a ghost of the father, haunts the adult psyche with invisible prohibitions. And since its standards are absolute, its punishment is endless. The more one strives for virtue, the more ruthless the superego becomes. Thus, many repeat pain not because they love it, but because their inner judge demands it as penance. I recall a patient who confessed that every time happiness approached, he felt anxious, almost unworthy. "It is as if," he said, "a voice inside me forbids joy." That voice was his superego, born of childhood fear. To disobey it felt dangerous, as though pleasure itself would summon punishment. And so he unconsciously destroyed every moment of peace, ensuring that guilt found its satisfaction. His misery was his obedience. The analytic cure demands that this internal tyranny be unveiled. We cannot abolish the superego, it is necessary for social life, but we can expose its cruelty. The goal is not to eliminate conscience, but to humanize it, to replace irrational guilt with genuine responsibility. When the ego ceases to serve as the superego's prisoner, it can begin to serve life. In every repetition, there lies a trace of guilt, a whisper of self-punishment. The masochist transforms passivity into pleasure because guilt demands suffering as atonement. The overachiever exhausts himself to appease an internal father who is never satisfied. The pious believer prays not for salvation but for permission to exist. These are not choices but compulsions, expressions of unconscious guilt inherited from childhood prohibitions. Only through analysis can guilt be traced to its source. When the patient realizes that the inner judge is not divine but paternal, a voice formed in the nursery, not in heaven, he gains the possibility of liberation. He begins to see that his repetitions were not moral necessities but psychic automatisms. And in that realization, the machinery of compulsion slows. Still, one must not romanticize healing. The unconscious does not vanish under analysis. It becomes integrated. The drives remain, but their tyranny softens. The goal is not perfection, but awareness to live with one's instincts without being enslaved by them. Civilization requires repression, but consciousness redeems it. To know why one suffers is already to suffer differently, with dignity instead of confusion. If you, my listener, to have wondered why your life seems to circle the same abyss, understand this: your unconscious is not your enemy. It is the archive of everything you once felt but could not express. Its repetitions are not punishments, but communications, messages written in the language of symptom and dream. Each recurring pain is a phrase in that hidden language, waiting to be translated. When you learn to read it, the compulsion loses its power. The past ceases to dictate the future. The wound becomes a story, not a sentence. There is, perhaps, a final cruelty and a final mercy in the unconscious. It never ceases its work. Even after analysis, even after insight, it continues to dream, to desire, to distort. We do not cure the unconscious. We learn to converse with it. To become conscious of repetition is not to annihilate it, but to transform it, to move from blind acting out to deliberate creation. The patient who once repeated his pain in silence may come to write, to paint, to love differently. The same libidinal energy that once animated the symptom now finds sublimation in art, thought, or service. Sublimation is not repression's enemy, but its evolution, the instinct raised to a higher register where it can be expressed without destruction. To sublimate is to take what was once forbidden and render it meaningful. Civilization itself is the collective sublimation of instinctual life. Our cathedrals, symphonies, and philosophies are monuments erected from repressed libido. Yet within each work of beauty, there still vibrates the tremor of its original desire. The unconscious leaves its fingerprints upon every creation. That is why true art always carries an undertone of conflict, of longing. In this sense, even genius is a form of repetition, the reenactment of primal passion transformed into symbol. But for most, the work of sublimation begins with acceptance. The modern man seeks to escape his contradictions, to silence his drives with noise, productivity, and distraction. Yet the more he denies his unconscious, the more tyrannical it becomes. The repression that builds cities also breeds neurosis. The modern Malay's anxiety without object, depression without grief, is the cry of a psyche over-civilized, estranged from its instinctual roots. We have mastered matter, but not ourselves. We repeat not only personal pain, but the collective neurosis of a culture built on denial. When I speak of understanding one's repetition, I do not promise serenity. To understand is to suffer consciously. The anesthetic of ignorance wears off, and one feels the raw pulse of instinct beneath the skin of reason. Yet in that awareness lies dignity. To recognize that your desire is not moral failure, but human inheritance is to reclaim your own depth. The psyche, once seen in its totality, ceases to be an enemy. You begin to sense that every impulse, even the most disturbing, seeks expression, not condemnation. In this way, knowledge reconciles you with your own shadow. You realize that the murderer, the lover, the child, the god, all dwell within. You see that morality, stripped of hypocrisy, is simply the management of drives for the sake of life. The saint represses instinct, the neurotic suffers from it, the mature individual integrates it. Freedom is not the absence of instinct, but the capacity to choose how to serve it. Let us return, then, to the beginning. Why do we keep repeating the same pain? Because pain is the echo of what remains unlived. Each repetition is a gesture toward life, however distorted. The unconscious drives you toward the scene of your suffering, because somewhere within that scene lies the key to your vitality. You return not merely to suffer again, but to reclaim what was lost when you first suffered your capacity to feel, to desire, to exist fully. The repetition compulsion, seen in this light, becomes a paradoxical form of hope. The psyche does not wish for destruction, it seeks completion. The past demands recognition so that it may finally become past. What is not remembered is not dead. It is alive, imprisoned, and clamoring for release. You cannot escape your unconscious by denial, only by dialogue. You must listen to your own symptom as you would to a wounded child with curiosity rather than contempt. The moment you stop calling it madness and begin to ask what it wants, the cycle of compulsion begins to loosen. Yet I must warn you, the unconscious will always outwit the ego that seeks to master it. The ego wishes for purity, consistency, and control. The unconscious speaks in riddles, embraces contradiction, and thrives on ambiguity. True self-knowledge is therefore not domination, but intimacy. You do not conquer your unconscious, you befriend it. You learn to dwell beside its darkness without being devoured. This, I believe, is the essence of maturity. To walk through one's inner labyrinth with a light of awareness, not to destroy the shadows, but to see their outlines clearly. To know that the demon that torments you at night is the same instinct that gives you creative power by day. To recognize that Eros and Thanatos are not enemies, but twins, life and death entwined in the same embrace. When you accept this duality, repetition loses its grip, for what you have accepted no longer needs to return disguised. The patient who once dreamt of drowning may still dream of water, but now it no longer suffocates, it cleanses. The one who repeated betrayal may still feel its sting, but now he sees the familiar wound and says, "Ah, this is my old story asking to be rewritten." In that moment of recognition, the compulsion transforms into choice. The same unconscious energy that once enslaved becomes the source of freedom. Freedom, however, is not forgetfulness. The unconscious will continue its whispering, its nocturnal theater, its mischief in dreams. But once you have learned its language, even its mischief becomes meaningful. You see that the unconscious is not evil but primitive, a repository of instinctual truth. Civilization's task is to educate it, not to silence it. Analysis, then, is not a cure in the medical sense, but an education in honesty. It teaches you to live with yourself without illusion. If you give me 23 minutes not of your clock, but of your courage, I will show you that your repetition is not madness, but memory. Not punishment, but persistence of life. The same energy that makes you weep can make you create. The same desire that once bound you to suffering can bind you to purpose. When you understand that, you cease to fear the unconscious. You become its interpreter, its custodian, its conscious ally. So, let us not speak of eradicating pain, but of transforming it. Let us not seek innocence, but integration. To live consciously is to carry the knowledge of one's darkness without despair, to allow desire its place without surrendering to it. When you can say, "Yes, I have loved what hurt me. I have repeated my wound, and I understand why," you stand at the threshold of freedom. For in that moment, the unconscious ceases to dictate. It begins to converse, and perhaps, at the end of all analysis, we arrive not at peace, but at understanding, a quiet recognition that man is forever divided, forever desiring, forever haunted, yet capable of reflection. The same drives that built the neurosis built the cathedral. The same instincts that repeat pain also forge art, faith, and civilization. In acknowledging them, we honor both our weakness and our greatness. So, my friends, when you find yourself again within the familiar pain, do not curse it as fate. Sit with it as a message from the depths. Ask it what it wants you to remember. For beneath every repetition lies the same truth. What has been repressed still loves you enough to return. And when you can finally welcome it, when you can say, "Yes, I see you," the pattern dissolves into awareness. You will still dream. You will still desire. But you will know who is dreaming, who is desiring, and that knowledge fragile, incomplete, but human is the beginning of wisdom.